This is the first segment for Thursday's class for AP Psych, and we pick up with disorders. And we will start with the fourth dissociative disorder called depersonalization disorder. And this is a disorder where people, in essence, just discontinue being human. They lose control of their behavior. They leave their body and have a mechanical or dreamlike appearance to other people. So dissociative disorders are disconnecting yourself from your personality in some form or fashion. And this one is probably even more serious than dissociative identity disorder because these people seem to just disconnect themselves from everything. So the question then is, why are dissociative disorders, why do they occur? Three of the answers are stress, and you can see this connected directly to amnesia. Most causes are obscure, and of course abuse as a child, which we talked about with dissociative identity disorder, is a possibility. We move on to our next subset, which is mood disorders. And these are emotional disturbances of many kinds that also affect physical, perception, and thought processes. There's really two types, unipolar and bipolar. The poles, of course, of opposite poles of behavior are mania, which is extreme overactivity, and then, of course, depression at the other end. So both manic and depressive is the idea of bipolar. Now these disorders are often called affective disorders with an A, and the person who suffers from this is often stuck at one end or the other of the emotional spectrum. The most common of these, of course, is depression. Some research indicates that difficulty concentrating and subtle changes in short-term memory are sometimes the first sign of the onset of depression. Clinical depression is differentiated from normal short-term depression. Clinical is more severe. And there's two types of clinical. Major depressive disorder. This is someone who has one episode of depression that lasts for several months, versus dysthymia, which is less intense but lasts 2 years and more. So these are two types of clinical or severe depression that can occur. Some depression can devolve into psychosis, meaning losing contact with reality. And as the person gets further and further into depression, they'll often disconnect themselves from reality. And sometimes brain injury can show the same symptoms as depression. And this, of course, can include even concussion. So depression and brain injury can sometimes show the same exact symptoms. And so in a concussion, of course, it's a temporary thing. Depression is very different. I would remind you of the video we saw, one of Phil's videos, where they imaged the brains of a person who was depressed and found that when somebody is temporarily depressed about something, the brain imaging and activity looks very similar to somebody who has clinical depression. But the big difference, of course, is that the person who is just temporarily depressed will come out of it very quickly. The depressed person continues in that state, and their brain imaging will reflect that for quite a while. So let's talk a little bit about mania and bipolar disorder. Mania is less common than depression. It's the high. The person can become grandiose, in other words, having self-esteem that is greatly inflated. But it almost always includes depression for a bipolar disorder. Bipolar is prevalent in both men and women, while depression is often found more often in women. And we'll be talking a little bit about the rationale behind that as we move forward. So let's take a look at some of the theories about what causes depression and mania, but mainly the depressive disorders. Aaron Beck, the cognitivist, says that it's cognitive distortions. That means bad patterns of thought, not a surprise coming from a cognitive theorist. And he says it includes such things as negative self-concept that may be at work. Considerable amounts of research support this view that when people have a negative self-concept, they're more likely to be depressed. But critics say depression could be the cause of the negative thought patterns and distortions, not the result of them. So you got a chicken and egg question there. Secondly, social factors, and this is the one I was just mentioning about women being more likely to be diagnosed as depressed. Are women socialized to become depressed more easily? In other words, are the symptoms of depression something that we tolerate more with women than we do with men? If a man gives the same symptoms or shows the same symptoms as a woman, are we more likely to just support the woman while really kind of giving the man a negative response, making him feel that he shouldn't be depressed? And is it true that diagnosticians are more likely to diagnose women as depressed because they expect women to respond more in a emotional way? So it's kind of an interesting question. Many female psychologists have pushed the idea that it's too often diagnosed for women and ignored when the same symptoms are found in men. And the third question would be the chicken and egg question. Does depression cause the sufferer to drive people away, causing it to become more intense? The depression sufferer enters a sort of a never-ending cycle in this particular case. So you can see how even if you're mildly depressed, it could end up being something much worse as a consequence of this. So now we move to the personality disorders. These vary from harmless eccentrics to cold-blooded killers who show rigid, maladaptive ways of responding to the environment. Anybody that has a personality disorder can cause serious distress to themselves and to others. So let's go through some of the categories here. And we'll start with schizoid personality disorder. This is a loner who lacks the ability to desire or form social relationships. Now, this isn't just somebody who is a hermit and stays off to themselves, but these types of people appear to be in a fog, and they have withdrawn from social behavior so completely that their behavior becomes very strange. And again, they don't seem to have any ability whatsoever to have social relationships with others. Although it's been a few years since this occurred, there was a shooter on the campus of Virginia Tech University who killed a few people, and he was diagnosed with the schizoid personality disorder. Let's move on to the next one, paranoid personality disorder. Very odd behavior, of course, and somebody who suffers from this is inappropriately suspicious and mistrustful of others. They often refuse to accept any blame on anything that they do or criticism. But remember, the symptoms are not severe enough to create psychosis, so they're still in touch with reality, but because they are so paranoid about things, they're incapable of functioning in society. Next is dependent personality disorder, and this is a person who is unable to make decisions on their own or to act independently. They cannot tolerate being alone. Now again, we all know people who are clingy and need others around and can't seem to survive without someone being around them. But what we're talking about here is somebody who suffers from this so dramatically that they cannot function. Avoidant personality disorder. This is somebody who's timid, anxious, and fearful of rejection. And these fears of rejection often lead to social isolation. So they won't go anywhere or do anything because they fear being rejected. And again, it's the difference between a hermit and somebody who cannot function in society. Then we go to narcissistic personality disorder. This is somebody who has a grandiose sense of self-importance and preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success. These are the type of people who need constant admiration and can't really function without it. So again, other than beyond just being a narcissist, they have a disorder that takes it to the extent of being unable to function. And finally, our catch-all phrase here for personality disorders is borderline personality disorder. These are people who tend to act impulsively and often in self-destructive ways. This disorder is both common and serious, and people who have this will often have instability in self-image, mood, and interpersonal relationships. So what we get here is somebody who has a disorder, and it's pretty obvious it's a personality disorder. It just can't be pinned down as any particular one, and so it's called borderline. And finally, we get to one that you're probably somewhat familiar with if you know anything about crime shows and other things like that, and this is the antisocial personality disorder. This is somebody who has a lack of empathy for others. At one time, this was known as a sociopath. Now, people like this can do all kinds of things that seem like they're very intelligent, and they may be, but because they have this disorder, they're unable to actually understand the feelings of others. So you'll find people who are con men or con women, in that type of case, or people who in some cases have been mass murderers, like the infamous mass murderer Ted Bundy. People like this often have a pattern of violent, criminal, or unethical and exploitative behavior towards others. Ted Bundy was somebody who was a very intelligent and actually a semi-attractive young man who continually had relationships with women where he would lure them to his home and then kill them. And he did so with he seemed to get sort of joy out of the process and not understand any of the suffering that the people had. The BTK killer in Kansas City is the same, and many other sociopathic killers that are kind of litter the history of the United States are people who would probably have been diagnosed as antisocial personality disorder. Causes of that particular disorder, antisocial personality, perhaps it's a consequence of damage to the prefrontal region of the brain during infancy. That's one theory and actually has some scientific basis to it. The family influence, many times it seems that they are rejected by one or both of their parents. The cognitivists say that the child who grows into this may be emotionally rejected and inadequately disciplined by their parents. Okay, the next category is schizophrenia. Now, the term itself means split brain, but not split as in physically broken, but split from reality and not a multiple personality disorder. So what we're talking about here is somebody who is detached from reality. So this includes somebody who is psychotic, which is the official term for being lost of touch with reality. These people may have hallucinations, and again, any kind of sensation that the person senses that doesn't actually exist is a hallucination. It's not always a vision. It can be a sound, it could be a feeling, it can be a taste, a smell. And they also then will often have delusions, which are beliefs that are not connected to reality, and they may have those frequently. These distorted thoughts often lead them to self-destructive behaviors and often to suicide. So now we're getting to the serious stuff. The types include disorganized schizophrenia. Now this is a childish regard for social expectations. The person is active, very active, but aimless and incoherent, and you'll often see from them bizarre and childlike behavior. The next one is a fascinating one called catatonic schizophrenia, and this is a severe disturbance of motor activity. The people who suffer from this will vacillate from a catatonic state, which is where their bodies will become very rigid in what looks like a very painful position that they have put themselves in. And this is somebody who will sometimes then go into extremely agitated states and then switch back to being catatonic, remaining immobile, mute, and impassive for long periods of time, days, months, sometimes even years. They'll just stay in one position, not move, perhaps rock back and forth a little bit, but this is a severe disconnect from reality and also disconnect from the sensations that their body are giving them as a result of the pain because they're stuck in these positions. The next one would be paranoid schizophrenia. And this is somebody with extreme suspiciousness and complex delusions. Now this is worse than paranoid personality disorder, as this involves bizarre delusions and a total loss of reality. So the person who has the personality disorder of paranoia is actually having these paranoid thoughts about things that are relatively real and connected to their lives. The paranoid schizophrenic is paranoid about things that don't actually exist because of a loss of touch with reality. And finally, their catch-all phrase here, or catch-all category is undifferentiated. This is